Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Diego Herrera. I am a specialist in financial markets for the IDB, and I work particularly. Excuse me, I'm listening to the translation in Portuguese. Change the channel. You can change the channel. Let me begin again because I was listening to the translation in Portuguese. Mariana also. Something happened technically there.
Digo que cuando hables vas a tener que bajar por el mínimo, escuchar el retorno que te...
Ok, perfecto. Gracias, thank you. Ok, voy a volver a comenzar. Buenos días.
Good morning, my name is Diego Herrera. I am the leader expert from the IDB. In particular, I work with everything having to do with regulations and supervision, financial issues, and more recently, we have been beginning with a job with networks for sustainability for regulators and supervisors of the financial sector. And the work that we do jointly with FI, it adds to the objectives of the development of financials that are green and sustainable in the region. I would like to first share a very quick vision of sustainability in the financial sector globally. And I would also like to do it from the standpoint of the supranational regulating entities. I think that the financial institutions have been facing very recently two large risks. One of them, all of the issues of climate risks, including those physical risks and of transition that are a reality that are becoming material through the exacerbation of the main risks of especially credit risk by the banks and the market risk in the case of capital markets, as well as in the materialization for risks that take to problems and that mandate that in the insurance sector there we have to create some payments for that. On the other hand, we also have risks that are more endogenous from the financial system that have to do with the social and governance issues. And those are derived from all of the operations of the financial institutions and the social externalities combined with climate change. So these risks are generated basically by the financial institutions, and they can be generated by the clients. And they result from the interaction of the financial institution with its clients in the financial sector and combined with the negative externalities and can generate greater problems. And they can amplify at the same time the risks in the financial sector. So for us, it's very important from the Inter-American, from the IDBs and UNEP FI, we've been working a long time to support the regulators and supervisors of the financial system. In that sense, and I thank for this invitation, UNEP FI, and I think it's very important that we work jointly together with the regulators and the development of the regulations and the public policies that would lead us harmoniously to be able to handle successfully the environmental risks, social and governance, but also those having to do with climate. So with this and with this brief introduction then, I am now going to present the panelists for today. And I will do so in a very diplomatic way, beginning with the ladies. And in this sense, then we have Mariana Escobar. Mariana is the person in charge of the Work Group for Sustainability of the Superintendency of Colombia. Mariana has over 12 years experience working in financial inclusion issues and sustainability in banking, and she's been working in important financial institutions as a consultant. Moreover, she has done so in other instances in the public sector as a director of the Department of Social Prosperity in Colombia, and has worked, among other issues, with something that very well related with sustainability, which is that issue of digital front. So Mariana has important studies in Boston and in the University of Columbia, New York. Mariana, welcome. Secondly, I will very briefly go on to the continent, the other continent. We have Ricardo Harris. Ricardo is the staff leader and director of the regulation department for the central bank in Brazil. From there, then, he has been spearheading all the issues having to do with central bank and specifically with those of regulation, all those topics that having to do with sustainability. He's also been a leader in all issues having to do with payment systems, regulations, and such. Before working in the central bank, he worked in several financial institutions. He worked in issues, for example, of mergers and acquisitions, among others. He has an MBA in the certification as a CFA. He welcome Ricardo then. And finally, we have Marcos Mancini, who is a senior advisor in sustainability from the United Nations for Development. He's been working in all financial centers of the Sustainability Network. Among other things, Marcos handles the secretariat of the G20 for the Sustainable Finance Study Group. And before working in these issues, he was in charge as the lead of the International Cooperation Group for Inquiry, which is one of the important areas from UNEP. He's also worked, among other things, with financial groups in Mexico and also has spearheaded important initiatives at the level of the stock exchange, even with indices related with the issue of climate change and sustainability with a investment base that has grown in 2 digits during 2 consecutive years. And furthermore, he was the person that was in charge of the Sustainability Committee in the Association of Banks in Mexico. So we'd like to welcome him as well, Marcos. And the idea is that we can have a talk more than something very formal. I would like to begin with the experiences of the supervisors and the regulators, of course. And directly, I would like to begin once again with the order, very diplomatically, with Mariana. Mariana is a person who has been working all of these issues very tirelessly for several years, and she's been working on a series of public policies. In particular, Mariana has been working with issues of taxonomies, among others. But I would like to ask you, in this case, Mariana, for the environmental and social and governance risks first, and then concerning the climate risk and the work that you have been performing at the Superintendency, Financial Superintendency of Colombia. And of course, in that perspective, again, what is it that lies ahead, especially with the changes made by the supranational regulating entities? Well, thank you, Diego, for the kind invitation to the superintendents to share with you your trajectory and your work in these issues. Specifically, I will begin with the last question, which is how does road been? Well, I think it's important to say that Colombia financial began in 2012, and it was developed. There was through a protocol, and we started setting up the basis for ASDG and the investment decisions, very much liaised to many of the objectives, but that's where we set the basis And this was a line through which the financial systems decided to start on. In addition to this protocol, there were other three commitments besides the incorporation of other the SDGs and reducing the footprints and many other aspects and all the issues having to do with communications of the progress and the green protocols, and also the design of these groups for mobilization, because this is what's led the superintendents to start this. It had to do with the deliverables, and I think that it's part of this green protocol, and we saw a growth of emissions, especially in the green market that was spearheaded by the banks. And most of the emissions to date has been spearheaded by the banking sector. And by seeing this dynamic movement generated by the capital market is when the superintendency decided to dwell into this. Now, there is an important thing. Your question about the supervisors that began to talk about this climate risk, but we see that this will expand, and we're starting to see the issues with with academia and such. So we wanted to promote was a change in paradigm in the market. There was a recognition, especially by the banking sector, of what the ASDGs or sustainability issues had to do with. But we wanted to begin as a superintendency to send you the message about this climate risk because it changes the paradigm. Previously, everything that we used to do was the perspective is how these impact the issues. Now what we're seeing is how they will impact my business. So we should introduce as supervisors this change in paradigms. And that's why we began this climate risk issue. When we started this, it was through a survey, and I always heard very clearly we included the green protocol, but we also began having the physical to transitional risks. When we went to other industries, which are no longer banks, and we're talking about from the investor's perspective, we could not ignore that they had a lagging in these issues in their decision-making process. So what we decided to do was to maintain this concept that although they recognize from international markets and included the issue of climate risk. So what we've done in integration, we have focused a lot in institutional risk because there was a lagging, and that's how we have been working with them. Soft regulation, guidelines, but also regulations that is mandatory. So we began with some practices for integrating the decision-making for pension funds, which are one of the main institutional investors in Colombia. And in May, we began talking about the risk factors. These are the worlds that we have to clarify. And that's what we did with these circulars. Now, to conclude, and I mentioned it now, what do we see for the future? Well, much more money, strengthening of the integration of these issues in decision making on behalf of the institutional investors. This is what we first wanted to do, and it's aligned with international issues, and we wanted to form part of those policies and the structures of their governance and the responsibilities of the directors. And that's how we were left with these. But we know that afterwards, we have to begin with the design and tools for this management. And that's, I think, where the market is going. And we have to emphasize this climate risk because we already have some tools that can be used. And that's where we're going to go. And we have to continue working with climate risks, already have some tools that allows us to talk a little bit more about this quantitative language in decision making. And on the other hand, biodiversity, I think that's very important, very complex, but we know, nevertheless, very important, and it has liaised to climate change. And I think that it's also one of the next tasks that are coming forth as supervisors when we're talking about ASDGs and all of these with green issues with the climate front. Thank you, Mariana, and excellent. I think that what you were saying concerning the future and what is coming along is very much liaised with what Yosco and the Basel Committee and the demands that of the XAPs from the Monetary Fund from the World Bank for the certain countries, and they're considering the climate risk and ASDG risk. Let me go now to Ricardo, and I would like then to ask Ricardo something very similar. Mariana is talking about paradigm shift. Brazil is one of the leading countries in environmental, social, and governance issues, but also for climate issues. So what are those policies, Ricardo, that have been implemented in the Bank of Brazil and that somehow have allowed us to have that integration to the financial sector and also more than the process itself, whether we have, as Mariana mentioned, has there been a paradigm shift in the sector and with the regulatory issues that we've implemented? Dale, Joseph. Well, thank you very much for this invitation and to talk a little bit about this evolution of this regulation from the ASDG issues in Brazil in the 80s, etc. We started with that, and the regulation passed the environmental laws that was changed. And later on, they created a legal basis that was necessary to include the environment vendors in their actions against the environment. This legal basis, after the legal standing, could be co-responsibilized and with the damages that were caused with the credit in all these societies. So this led us to talk about these financial risk as well as the tangible perception and the social and corporate responsibility. So in 1995, the great public Brazilian banks had created a green protocol through the Ministry of Environment. This protocol was voluntary to be considering the environmental factors in the asset management and all their investment analysis. So this was extended to other private banks and the Brazilian Federation of Banks. So in 2008 and 9, they passed the first laws for the financial sector in this regard. These were related to continue forward with investment issues, and it had to do with banks who started with agricultural loans. And then finally in 2014, the historical framework and financial regulations in Brazil for communication of the regulations began with international issues to be liaised to create this norm. And because of the exposure that began with the United Nations Conference for the Sustainable Development, and also from a discussion process with participation with academia and with international agencies. So this norm determines the financial sector as environmental risks and to establishing their responsibility and social risks. And the financial risks had to observe these in leading their businesses in the relationship that they could have. So it has to do with supervision, and we had to perfect these norms that were discussed in a public survey in April of this year that will create a norm, even at the end of this month, as a matter of fact. And these norms, which have to do with thematic and environmental risk on thematic risks, basically, that are impacting the financial sectors. And they are issuing objectives that ensure the effectiveness of this policy. It was then that these were published this year, the two consultations, public consultations, one mandating to distribute information on risks and opportunities related with the social environmental problems as an EFD, and also to establish the social issues. And another had to do with the creation of a credit bureau that I think will help very much with green title development for Brazilian agriculture. Yeah, thank you very much, Ricardo. Very clear presentation. I think the public consultation issues are a very important tool to understand the perception of the public concerning the norms. Many jurisdictions in the region have been adopting them in a more firm manner, and I think they allow better understanding the general perception of the adoption of these norms. And I think that this is a very important road that you've embarked on with a ambitious goal that has to do with environmental, social, and climate risk. And it's a great road to follow by the rest of the countries. Thank you very much, Ricardo, for your answer. Let me go now to Marcos. Marcos, for us, it's very interesting to see the dynamic that the G20 has had along it. And recently, there has been a study group created for sustainable finances at the G20. What can you tell us about that work group and how the Latin American countries and the Caribbean can be benefited from the results of this work? Because the G20 sounds like something is rather far away, and many times it's difficult to land the concepts of that G20 to what is happening in our region. Well, thank you, Diego, and thank you, everyone, for your kind invitation. I would like to address or to take a couple of topics regarding this paradigm shift in this question of yours of how we can continue with a political process that in many countries in the region are not participating in. So, on the one hand, regarding a paradigm shift, and going back a while in history, at a given point during the financial crisis of the 90s, because the G8 would not include those economies that it had to include. And in 2008, the G20 began holding these leaders summit. And we have it as it looks today. In sustainable finance issues in the G20, we have been addressing these throughout the years because the G20 would support the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, but many times divorced from those of you can see finance and development. So it's interesting when this group was established in 2015 for the Chinese presidency as a green finance study group. The group then continued with the Argentinian presence where they expanded the mandate of sustainable finances, recognizing that we have to include other issues other than environmental through an international context. And under the Italian presidency, it was established because then they would see a value in connecting and identifying those gaps in the agenda concerning the sustainable finance ecosystem that developed, because we saw when the group began in 2006 to date, it completely changed. At the end of 2017, the network of central banks. At the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, then we have the Coalition of Ministers of Finance, many networks, the IOSCO network as well. So today, this group is playing a different role than what it played in the beginning. Many topics have been studied. China, with green banks, bonds, risk analysis, informations, and during 2017, 2018, market capitals. Today, I would say that the group is playing a role as a coordination role internationally, supporting politically all of these networks. The group, as you said it correctly, changed to a work group. So it has a little more teeth, if you will, now, and can provide recommendations of a political nature, and that has a great permanence within the G20. And this is important because of the mandates they have. The BAS group has two deliverables for this year. One is the synthesis report, studying 3 issues in particular: the agenda for sustainability reporting, tools to align the investments to the MDGs, and secondly, how to align the operations of the financial institutions internationally to the 2030 agenda. So those 3 issues are condensed or summarized through the synthesis. And the second big deliverable is a roadmap for the G20 concerning finance, green finance. And this is a little bit of a paradigm shift, and that's why mentioning this evolution of the G8, G20 Leaders Summit. The mandate is not to create a roadmap for the group per se of sustainable finance working group. It's rather to create a roadmap for the G20 in sustainable finance. And we see this in the development. So the group then works a little bit as the liaison between both tracks. And this is important precisely because for this paradigm shift, having to do with biodiversity issues, for example, for climate risk issues, we know today that it's very important to see the carbon price. For this sustainable issue, it's very important to deal with issues such as changing the legal status of nature or consideration of ecocide as something punable. And all these issues like that are not naturally seen in the finance track of the G20. It's addressed more like macroeconomic and financial stability issues, but then we could also see as a natural complement within the development track. So I think that at the level of international governance, we're seeing a lot more liaison between both tracks. Now, within Latin America, obviously, we have among countries and members of the G20, we're seeing this agenda that has positive externalities. And what we've been working in this regard in Latin America, the Green Protocol. So it gave way to other protocols in the region. The protocol in Mexico, for example, seeing what Brazil was seeing, and in the same way, the policies that are implemented right now, it will have some important issues. So this is also being spearheaded from other sides where you can have other countries as well in Latin America, such as Peru and Chile, that are very much involved with that agenda. So if it's not through that G20 agenda, it could also be done through the APEC agenda. Excellent. Yes, yes. I think that it's very important to land these issues in the region and the true problems we have in the region in different countries or the ones that are more developed. Well, then we will continue now with our next topic, which is not a lesser topic, and that has to do with insurance. During the last couple of years, EIs, which is the International Association for Insurance Supervisors, that also has, sitting in the Bank of International Settlements from the Basel Committee, and the Sustainable Insurance Forum, they issued a document to request the supervisors to integrate the climate risks within their agenda. Now, the document basically brings forth a series of questions that the supervisors have to respond concerning this climate risk about how to incorporate them, for example, in those issues of the prime and how to supervise these risks, among others, for the payment of these claims. It's important what the people have been doing EIs. And as a matter of fact, Mariano, I wanted to ask you, what has the financial superintendency's vision been regarding this document, and what is expected from the institutions that are being supervised concerning the incorporation of such risks, climate risk, etc., within your systems of risk management? Well, thank you very much, Diego. Well, first, as you mentioned, I believe that they have been coming along for several years now, preparing us for this document. IS has already published a couple of papers that were preparing us and paving the road for that new introduction. A paper that pretty much summarizes the discussions and strengthen and gives us clearer instructions. So what is our perspective? Countries like Colombia, all of these processes have to be gradual in their implementation so that we can give them enough time to prepare, understand, and incorporate these, not only in an area of sustainability, but in a cross-cutting fashion in the organizations, which could be insurance companies that, as we all know, are exposed to these processes. through the policyholders, but also through their investments. So in that regard, we have to incorporate rather these gradually. So in Colombia, how do we see that the right way to implement this would be? I think the first thing is to begin with governance and information request. And as an intern, we've been using the application paper that was published, and we began requesting information. In that regard, we first started requesting information through a survey, through risks and opportunities regarding climate change. And this is separated and structured per industry because as a superintendency, we see over various industry. And for the insuring companies, we have a special questions about their exposure, their signing, the investments to climate risk, and how these issues have had to do, whether they've made investment and how they see their role as experts, at least in physical risks. And in Colombia regarding El Nino and El Nino, which are the two more important physical risks. And that's where we started requesting information. The second front that we're attacking in our work was through the issuance of the circular of a norm. This norm is the one that I mentioned originally that covered the pension funds, but that's where we began asking them or requesting, instructing insurance companies to begin from a new perspective and to begin communicating or telling us how or whether they were incorporating these issues in their decision-making process for investments and whether this was included in their investment policy. Again, these steps respond to what we saw in the state of the market that we just began with conversations, and those recommendations have to be integrated within the regulatory framework gradually. As an authority, we have an application paper, and this became a roadmap that we considered we can continue working with this. Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with the last thing you said. And so I insist, ever since I began this dialogue, I think that the role of the supranational agencies for regulation is essential because, as a matter of fact, they offer a guideline, a roadmap, if you will, to follow for the various stakeholders, and especially for supervisors and regulators. So with this, thank you very much, Mariana. I would like to very quickly go on to Ricardo once again. Ricardo, just a while ago when you were talking about what Brazil had done in the legal basis, you mentioned about the resolution that was issued in 2014, and that formed the basis for the rest of regulatory issues that the Bank of Brazil has done. I think it would be important to hear from your side what the main results have been or the balance for that. Sí, estate listo. And how this has been done with this and whether they've gone through the mitigation of social, environmental, and climate risks. As I've mentioned, we've had to go through the central bank so we have to follow the governance structures regarding risks to follow with our business. And this brought further attention of the financial sector, and it helped us to promote the culture of sustainability and to stimulate the processes for risk mitigation. In the 2014, it led us people to take us to those information. These are the principles that were adopted regarding sustainability, and also so that we may act in a proactive way. These initiatives have been left as regulations with the associations bank. And this was then published. So the regulator then had some challenges for the supervision of the central bank in Brazil. So it had to adapt its procedure, its methodologies for acting. In the 2014, and it had to implement these heterogeneously due to some of the financial issues, and in the acting of these peoples, and the great banks established a more complex structure regarding their deliverables and services offered. This public consultation of the central bank incorporated the main points of what was identified in this first cycle in the supervision of this rule, and for strides made in international issues. But just a little while ago, even after this year of the country agreement regarding climate and financial issues, especially regarding adjustments that are being proposed in these rules are, for example, first, segregation of social environmental issues. There are very clear examples. And there is an explicit inclusion in the climate sphere, which is something that has to do with regulations, with events related to physical risks and those of transition, and application to three requisites who have established all the other requisites, cooperation markets or declarations for risks and management for continuance of business. These are the requisites that form the risks and that maintain proportionality. So these are more robust and more complex and stronger regarding to those institutions that they have to comply with the simplified prerequisites to be prudent and to make them adequate. Yeah, thank you very much, Ricardo. Yes, we can see that these are important risks, and this is key for the identification and measurement of these issues. Now we are living these, seeing systemic risk with 4 countries, and I think that is the most relevant point. Now, let me quickly go to Marcos. We are left with only 10 minutes. For this conversation, I would like to ask Marcos to be very quick with his answer, and essentially, we're going to focus on the impact and the way that the countries of the region can anticipate everything the work groups have been doing from G20, and as well, what groups such as the one that you mentioned a little while ago have been doing, the NGFS, the JOSCA group, etc. So what can be done, and how can the financial institutions and regulators help in the future? Well, thank you very much, Diego. Well, obviously, to continue the agenda for the G20 from APE, from the various networks, such as NDFS and the Coalition of Networks and others, it's a good start for private sector institutions, but also to remember that there are many networks in the private sector that are advancing and many times have advanced this agenda before the regulators even. Many of these agendas have been used by the private sector previously. So I believe that concerning the discussion or participation and the dialogue with the public sector, I think that these networks play an essential role. The principle of responsible banking, among others, for example, the TNFD concerning biodiversity, and well, many of the same networks that are more financial in nature and that many financial institutions in Latin America belong to, the IIF, just to mention one, but also the FIAP and the PIAB and the FELABAN. All of these financial institutions networks have already adopted this sustainability issues. And through these networks, I think that we can boost this agenda further. And it's been done so in many countries as issued by the private sector. Something that I would mention to close is the regulation of these issues is something that is emerging. It's new regulation, and in many aspects, we still don't know the impact that these regulations have had in many countries. And that's where I believe the international agencies or the multilateral development agencies will have to play an important role in the legislation that is being passed to address these topics. Thank you. Perfect, Marco. And I would like to conclude now with a very quick round. Everyone has just 1 minute, please, to speak of one or two issues. And this is how it'll be. One is environmental risks, social, and those of governance. And the other topic is climate risks. And I would like to ask you, why do you see that in the future we will have these in the two categories? And I will begin backwards now, breaking the order by Marcos, and I will close with Mariana. Well, in the G20, then I would say that the phrase is climate first. And that's how we're addressing this in international fora. In many other different fora. And then following these, we have the other issues. So I would say the ESG risks, and we have to continue with this. And so, déjale abierto. Excellent. Ricardo, what is your perspective from Brazil? Yes. Sorry, Diego, my computer is acting up on me, he says. So I don't know what let's continue with Mariana first. Yes, Mariana, no cierres, no cierres, no cierres. So, okay, well, thank you. It's impossible not to react. What we see here locally, at least in Colombia, and I assume that in many of the discussions that we've seen in the region as well, is that they talk about the DSG, first of all. Which is a legacy issue, but they don't segregate these with the climate as a subset thereof. And the market really requests us to keep with integration and socialization issues. In the future, I see clarity regarding the SDG issues, greater clarity that we're working with the SDGs. And it's not very clear though, but I think that's the next frontier to develop our market so that this can be included. Okay, excellent. I agree with you. Ricardo, now you, please. Well, thank you very much. I believe that climate risk is one of the great challenges that we have ahead of us with the central banks, and I think especially with development issues, with the different tools and management thereof and other scenarios. And climate change is very different to the financial issues and very difficult to model. And this can help us so that we can continue working and not make the same mistakes as before. And it has a great potential to to free up these impacts in other issues rather than other structural changes. And in general, these are reversible. And I think something that is more important to address, these are to have comparable, consistent data to make them trustworthy also. The good thing is that these issues touches agenda from several different international fora and the issues that are being worked upon and that we have to arrive at. Well, thank you very much, Ricardo. And we'll close this panel with this now. I think it's been a very interesting discussion with different standpoints. And without a doubt, what is coming for the region is very interesting regarding the regulatory change, specifically for ESG. And I think that YOSCA will also issue something toward the middle of 2022, regulatory changes for banks toward the end of 22. And what YICE has been doing is reveals that we're going to have some regulatory changes in the coming years as well. So the majority of the sectors are going to be covered by these regulations, beginning by the ESG regulations. So with this, thank you very much. And Unit F5 for their kind invitation. And let's continue with the next panel. Thank you all very much.